In progress.
Okay, we're going to start from Daf Samach Dalet Amud Aleph. The Mishnah is describing Hataras Nedarim. Hataras Nedarim is that you go to a Rav and he gives you a Pesach. He tells you that had you thought of this circumstance, would you have made the neder? And if you say no, then they're not to the Nedarim. So the Mishnah is describing different circumstances that the Rav can give as a Pesach. So the Mishnah says, Rav Elazar Omer, Paischin la'adam b'kibur aveim. Now this is a massive heter, and that is, we know, as we've had until now, Nedarim was not done by the most righteous of people. It was considered more Rishoim dikazach to make a neder, which means every time you made a neder, it wasn't good for your family name. So the Rav, says Rav Eliezer, can go to the person and say, had you known when you made the neder that your parents it would be a lack of kibbur of aim, that people would be saying to your parents, this is who you raised, that you made nedarim, that your kid makes nedarim. Had you known that would take place, had you made the neder, and if he says no, then you could be matir nedarim. Now this is obviously a very broad, inclusive Pesach, but that's a legitimate Pesach. Paischin la'adam b'kibbur of aim. Chum disagree, they say no, it's asr. Now why? The reason is very simple. Pashtus is from Abaya. Abaya is going to explain. The reason is very simple, and that is, when you ask the guy a question, he has to be able to answer honestly. You go over to a guy and you say, hey, you made a neder. If you knew that your parents would be upset, would you still do it? What type of person would say, yeah, I would still do it? What type of Rasha would do such a thing? So you're not giving him the opportunity to answer honestly. Rav Eliezer feels that maybe a person would say, yeah, I don't care about my parents that much. The Chum say, no one would answer that honestly. So you're not giving him much of a choice. You're going to go over to someone and say, hey, you know that you're making your parents miserable. If you knew that, would you care? And what do you want him to say? No, I wouldn't care. Of course he's going to say I would care, but he doesn't really care. So you're not giving him an opportunity to actually answer honestly. So the Chachamim disagree. Amar Rav Tzaddik says to Rav Eliezer, according to you that Kibbur of aim is a legitimate Pesach. Why not just use cover of God? You're right. What's the point? You're saying that Pesach for Rav Eliezer is, you could say, had you known that Nedarim is only done by Rishoim and it's giving your family a bad name, had you done it? If it's done by Rishoim, then why don't you say to the guy, had you known that Hashem is unhappy with you, right? Every neder is against the Ratzon Hashem. Then tell the guy, had you known. Right? So why can't you do that? If you're going to go all out, then go all out. If you're going to use a Pesach that Nedarim is only done by Rishoim, and therefore it's bringing a lack of kibbud av aim, so why not say, if you knew that it was a lack of kavod hamakim, if you knew that it was against the Ratzon Hashem, would you do such a thing? He says, it goes so further. The Gemara says, Mishnah says, Imkein ein Nedarim. Nah, that's too far. That can't be a Pesach. Meaning everybody agrees, although they argue about whether kibbud of aim is a legitimate Pesach, everyone agrees you cannot use kavod hamakim, the kavod of Hashem, as a Pesach. Now, why? The Gemara will give two explanations. Pashtus reason is because that even Rav Eliezer will agree you're not giving guy the opportunity to answer honestly. Meaning, the guy might say, yeah, I don't really care about my parents' kavod. I do care. He might answer honestly, but you're going to go over to a Jew and say, hey, a rabbi is going to go over to the Jew and say, hey, if you knew that Hashem was unhappy, would you still do it? What type of person would say, yeah, I'd still do it? Nobody. So that your mamish not giving him an opportunity to answer honestly. Okay. Moedim chacham. So you have a machlokes by kibbur of aim. Everyone agrees kavod hamakim is not a good Pesach, but moedim chacham l'Rav Eliezer b'davar shebeinu levein imay shepoislim b'kavod av imay. But everyone agrees, although they argue about whether kibbur of aim is legitimate Pesach, but if the neder is about the parents, let's say the neder is not, stam, right? What's kibbur of aim? Stam. Stam is that the guy made a neder, he's not going to eat milchik. So you go over to him and say, listen, people are talking about your family, that the only people that make nedarim are Rishoim, and it's really not good for your parents. That's a machlokes. But let's say the neder was, my parents are cut off from me. You made the neder about the parents, then everyone agrees you could use kibbur of aim as a legitimate Pesach. Why? So Pashtus, that follows Abaya's reasoning, again the Gemara will discuss this, but Pashtus, the reason is, what's the objection to kibbur of aim generally? What type of guy will answer honestly? This guy made a neder about his parents. He's willing to answer honestly. Meaning the reason why the Chachamim are against using kibbur of aim as a Pesach in general is because they say, what type of Jew is going to say, I don't care about my parents? But if the neder is about the parents, this type of Jew would. So he actually would answer honestly. So if he says, I don't care, then he legitimately doesn't care. If he cares, he'll tell you. As long as, basically, the basic premise is you have to give the guy opportunity to answer honestly. If you give him no opportunity to answer honestly, that's not a good Pesach. So everyone agrees you can't use kavod hamakom. Kivud Avim is machloikas, but everyone agrees that if the neder is about the parents, you could use Kivud Avim as a neder. Those are the three categories. Okay, second machloikas in the Mishnah, Oid Amar Rav Elazar, Poischim benoilid v'chachamim oiser. And that is like this. It's an interesting thing. What if you have a circumstance that came up, that changed, but that's also not necessarily foreseen? Meaning it's not a common occurrence. Could you use that as a Pesach? So you'll say, why not? It's an interesting thing. It's a machlokes. It's a machlokes whether you can use a Pesach of something that came up after the fact, it developed after the fact, and it was not the most common thing. Now, the Rabbi Eliezer says, yeah, because that's the whole point of a Pesach. Had you known this would happen, would you have done it? He says, no. Well, exactly. So it's slightly uncommon. It's uncommon, the levels you'll have to see. But the reason why the Chacham are against it is because like this. The whole point of a Pesach is, you say to the guy, would you have done this again? Would you have done this if you had, let's say, what's a classic example of a Pesach? A guy makes a neder, he's going to go to the mikveh every day, and then all of a sudden it's the winter, and it's really cold, and he's like, they say, well, had you thought about this? He's like, I wouldn't have. Now that's not something that developed, that's not out of the, he just didn't think of it at the time. You have something that's mamish out of the the blue. A guy makes a neder, and then his football team, which is unheard of, they make the Super Bowl, whatever, and now he has to go this, he can't go there because he wants to see it. He asked the guy, that's a machlokes. Why? Because the whole point of a Pesach is, would you have done it differently if you had all the information? Like if we not all the information, if we went back in time, would you have done it differently? Over here, because it's unlikely, you could see a guy saying, it sounds like an irrational thing. I'd do it again. Right? There are certain things where it's like, at the time, I think it made sense. Meaning, if at the time you didn't, like about the mikvah.
The example you gave when we first did this, is like, I'm going to go to Midian every day for a year, and then COVID is no minyan.
Exactly. Well, so it's like, if we were to go back, would you do it the same? You'd be like, yeah, I would do it the same. Obviously, with all the information, you would do it differently, but the question is, the average person, basically, if you just go back in time, would you do it again? I would do it again. I know that sounds crazy because it's like, well, then you're an idiot. But the answer is, because it's unforeseen, I couldn't have done anything differently. I took the risk, and it was worth it at the time. It's interesting of how you look at it, but that's the machlokes of whether you could use a noilid, an unforeseen circumstance that's uncommon, as a Pesach. It basically has to do with, like, because you're not rewriting history. You're basically saying, we're going to do a redo. So the guy could say, you know what, honestly, such a small percentage, I'd do it again. That's the machlokes of whether that is a legitimate form of a Pesach. Again, it's in Lumdis. It's interesting because again, you see from here, it's not just like a redo with all the information. It's like a redo legitimately at the time. If I were to give you a second chance, would you do it? And a lot of people would say like, they bet this and this, and they're like, yeah, at the time, I think it made sense. So it's an interesting in Lumdis of how to understand it, but that's the machlokes. The Mishnah gives 3 examples of noilid. Again, these are things that developed afterwards that are not the most common. They're kind of unheard of. They're not like COVID level crazy, but not the most common thing. What are the examples? Ketzad, Amar Koinim Shani Nenel Ish Ploini. A guy says, I'm not benefiting from, Reuben says, I'm not benefiting from Shimon. Okay? And then Nasa Seifer. All of a sudden, Shimon, in the age of his 40s, he changes professions. Now, who is supposed to see that coming? All of a sudden, he is now the town Seifer. So I'd like to benefit from him because he's the town Seifer. Now, who would think that at that age he would change professions? Or all of a sudden he marries off his kid. Now you're going to say, well, marrying off a kid is not so uncommon. So the Mefarshim explain it means that like you made the neder for 3 months and the wedding wasn't supposed to take place. Meaning they changed the date of the wedding. That's not a common thing, to make the wedding early. So basically, Reuven cuts off Shimon. Shimon's making a wedding in 6 months. They say, but you're making a neder against him. He says, yeah, but that's in 6 months. I'm not gay now. All of a sudden, he changes the wedding. The wedding's next week. Who's supposed to think of that? That's an unforeseen circumstance. And he says, so that's an example of where the Chum are against it, or Velez is okay with it. Or the last one is, a person says, I swear I'm not going to enter this house. Manasseh Beis Knesset. All of a sudden, the community decides that's going to become the new shul. How am I supposed to see that? Who was supposed to see that coming? That's okay. So we'll get to all this later on, but today's daf is going to be dealing with the first section of the Mishnah, which again, just to review. The question is, what's a legitimate Pesach? We have 3 halachas in the beginning of the Mishnah. Everyone agrees you cannot use kavod hamakom, the kavod of Hashem. That's not legitimate. We'll see why. It's a machlokes whether you can use kivud of aim, and using kivud of aim when the neder was about the parents, everyone agrees is okay. Fine. So now, my ein nedarim. Everyone said in the Mishnah you cannot use kavod hamakom. Again, the Rav wants to say, and this is Rav Tzaddik says to Rav Eliezer, why can't you say the following? The guy comes forward, he made a neder. Whatever the neder is, every neder in the world you could answer with the following Pesach. Does Hashem like nedarim? No. So if you knew that you were angering Hashem, would you have done it? Everyone agrees no good. The question is why? So there's 2 explanations. Amr Abaya, imkein ein nedarim netarim yafa. Abaya says, very simple. Go to the next page. Abaya says, no one is going to answer honestly. Meaning, you want to say kivud of aim, you go over to a guy and you say, hey, you know your nedarim are angering your parents. Would you have done it? There are some people who are like, yeah, I don't care. I don't care about them. And some people would say, I do care about them. But at least there's an option. What type of Jew is going to go when a rabbi says to him, hey, you know you're angering Hashem, would you still do this? What type of person is like, yeah, I do it again? No one's going to do that. They're all going to just say, of course not, even though they don't actually mean it. So Abaya says you cannot use a Pesach if you're not giving him a legitimate Pesach. He doesn't have a choice to answer honestly. So that's the problem. So therefore, parents is a machlokes, because some Rav Eliezer feels a person will answer honestly about his parents. Chum disagree, fine. But kavod hamakom, nobody. That's Abaya's take. And Abaya, by the way, I'll speak this out and then we'll see it inside. The flow of the Mishnah is very easy. Parents is a machlokes, whether people will say, meaning Rav Eliezer says, a person will answer honestly about kivud of aim. You go over to someone and you say, hey, you know that your neder is angering your parents. Would you have done it again? Some people will say, yeah, I'd do it again. I don't care about them. Some people won't. Chum disagree. They say, no, a person won't answer honestly about a parent. Though, fine, but it's debatable. Kivud hamakom, no Jew is going to tell a rabbi, I don't care about God. So that's not a good Pesach. But the end of the Mishnah is, everyone agrees if the neder was asering the parents, you could use it as a Pesach. Why? Because the guy, what's the whole concern? The whole concern is, will he answer honestly about angering his parents? He asered his parents. He's clearly willing to push the boundaries. So fine, so that's the flow of the Mishnah. The whole crux of the shaila of the Mishnah is, will a person answer honestly? By Hashem, no. By parents, debatable. When the neder is about the parents, yes. Okay, fine. That's Abaya's take on the Mishnah. Rabbi has a different explanation. He says, Imkein ein nedarim nishal l'chacham. Rabbi says, that's not my concern. The reason why you can't use kivud hamakom as a Pesach is because you know what's going to happen over time? No one's going to go to Rabbanim anymore. What neder can be removed by the kavod hamakom? Every single one. So you know what's going to end up happening? A guy's going to make a neder. They're going to say, hey, you want to do a Taras Dam? You should go to a rabbi. He's like, okay, why? So he could say, are you asking about God? I'll do it myself. What you've basically removed the concept of Rabbanim doing Hataras Nedarim. So it's a very practical issue. By parents, debatable, but the issue with kavod hamakom is not whether a person will answer honestly. Is that once you're giving a heter that can be used across the board for every neder, so what's the point of Hataras Nedarim anymore? No one's going to go to a Rav. They're just going to do it themselves. And over time, they're just not going to do it. So therefore, that's the problem. Now, the issue with this is just the flow of the Mishnah. And this is the Gemara. I just want to say it outside. The flow of the Mishnah, according to Abaye, makes a lot of sense. The whole shaila is, will a person answer honestly? By God, no. By parents, debatable. But when the neder is about the parents, yes. That's the flow. But according to Rava, the shaila is, will a person end up going to Rabbanim? So by God, no. They'll just do it themselves. by parents, it's debatable. But says the Mishnah, but when the neder is about the parents, then it's fine. Why aren't you concerned that when the neder is about the parents, they won't go to Rabbanim? Meaning, if you know that when the neder is about the parents, you don't have to, you could just do Ataras Nedarim easily because just say, oh, had you known, blah, blah. So then why aren't you concerned the same thing? People won't go to Rabbanim anymore. So I'll just say outside, the answer is very simple, and that is the heter of God is a heter for 100% of the Nedarim. That's why Rav is concerned. That's why the Gemara is concerned that they won't go to Rabbanim. The heter of Ataras Nedarim, when it's about the parents, yes, it's an all-inclusive heter for that category. Yes, if someone makes a neder about his parents, he will 100% get Ataras Nedarim by saying, would you care about your parents? But that will not apply to Hataras Nedarim about not eating cheese and Hataras Nedarim about not. It's not something that will apply to other circumstances. Rava's objection, the Gemara is going to explain this. The objection of using Hashem is that it's an all-inclusive heter for 100% of the Nedarim.
Also, the person with it, neder about their parents, so they don't care about their parents.
True.
So they're not.
Oh, that's a good point also, but at least it's an option. I hear what you're saying. You're saying that it's you're statistically.
No, which means that the neder is taken.
But that's a bias. That's already using a bias like rationale into Rava's world a little bit. But yeah, I hear what you're saying. But the point is, Rava, it's more, we want to make sure Hataras Nedarim is still employed. So says the Gemara, Rava Amar, Imkein ein nedar mishal l'chacham. Rava says the objection of Hataras Nedarim about using God as a reason for Hataras Nedarim is because then no one's going to go to a rabbi anymore. They're just going to do it themselves. So the Gemara says, Tanan, so that's the machlekes Abai and Rava. What's the issue with using God as Hataras Nedarim? Abai says it's because no one's going to answer honestly, and Rava says it's because no one's going to do Hataras Nedarim anymore. So Tanan, Modim chacham l'Rav Elazar b'chaver b'davar shebein beino levein av v'imo sheposel b'kavra v'im. Everyone agrees that if the neder is about the parents, that you could use the parents as a pesach for Hataras Nedarim. So the Gemara says, Bishlam alabaya damar imkein ein nedarim nitarim hachakim v'dichtzav le hachitzvav le. Abaya, the flow of the Mishnah is very nice. The whole issue is, will a person answer honestly? By God, no. By parents, debatable. But over here, because he made the neder about the parents, yeah, he'll answer honestly. That's why everyone agrees it's a legitimate Pesach. The flow is very nice. Elo l'Rava, damar imkein ein nedarim nishal l'chacham. But if Rava's objection of using Hashem is that it's such an inclusive heter that you could just use it without going to a rabbi, then Amai poischen, then why is it that everyone agrees by the parent that it's illegitimate? You should be the same concern. If you made a neder about the parent, and we're going to allow you to just use this heter, then you're not going to go to a rabbi in such a circumstance. The answer is, you're right. The answer is, you're right, but that's only an all-inclusive heter for a subcategory. Meaning, when you use God as a Pesach, that's an all-inclusive heter for 100% of the Nedarim. That basically will abolish going to Rabbanim. We are comfortable using the heter, which is a pretty inclusive heter, when you made a neder about a parent. For that what? That 5% of Nedarim? Okay, so for 5% of the Nedarim, people will be lax. But using God is 100% of the Nedarim. You allow that, you basically got rid of Hataras Nedarim. That's the fundamental difference. Now, just for the end of the daf is Zakutitsky. It's very interesting. It's very famous, actually. It's a very famous concept. You had a machlokes whether Noilid is a legitimate Pesach. Again, something that was unforeseen and out of the ordinary. My time at Rav Elazar. Why is Rav Elazar cool with using Noilid? Where does he get it from? What's the source that Noilid is a legitimate Pesach? So Amar Rav Chizda Amar Kra. The basic flow is like this. So the Gemara says, interesting, the conclusion is interesting. We know that Moshe Rabbeinu, according to the Medrash, the Gemara is going to quote in tomorrow's daf, I believe. According to the Medrash, Moshe Rabbeinu made a neder to Yisro that he will not leave Midian to go back to Egypt without Yisro's permission. Okay. The pasuk tells us that he didn't. He didn't end up asking. He just left. Now, why was it allowed? He made a neder. This is all from the Medrash. So the Gemara is going to say Hashem gave a Pesach for Hataras Nedarim. What did Hashem say? The pasuk says Ki meisu kol anoshim. That Hashem said, you made the neder because the people people were trying to, Das and Aviram were trying to kill you, right? The whole reason why he ran away from Egypt, because the pasuk says that he saw two Jews hitting each other. It was Das and Aviram. He told when he called them Rasha, they told on him, and then the whole court case, and then he fled. So Hashem said, Ki mesu kol anashim, those people are dead, you can go back. Meaning the neder that he made to Yisro was contingent on, I'm not going to go back to Egypt because it's dangerous, because those people are after me. And Hashem said, don't worry, the neder that you made, I'll give you a Pesach. They're dead now. Now, meaning, and had you known they'd be dead, would you have made the neder? No. That's a noilid. That's a noilid. That's an unforeseen circumstance. I mean, unforeseen. Due to with genocide, but that was not foreseen at the time. That's something that developed later, and you see, it's a good Pesach. So he says like this. If you look at Rashi, Moshe Rabbeinu made a neder to Yisro. I'm not going to go back because Dasan and Aviram are after me. Hashem says you can go back because they died. So that's. I'm sorry.
The neder wasn't made because they're after me. It was made because Yitro didn't want him to leave with his.
But apparently, no. Again, this is all from the Medrash. Rashi is saying that the neder was because bishvil. It was because that it was obviously included in the neder. I'm not going to go back, not just because you want your son-in-law around. I'm not going to go back because they're after me. But meaning that was obviously how he verbalized it. But had they not been after him, he would go back. So that was the neder. Hashem said, something happened, something changed, they're dead now. You can go back. And you see that you could use a noilid, you could use a development that you would not have known at the time as a unforeseen circumstance, as a legitimate Pesach. Okay. Now, so the Gemara says, V'misa de noilid hu, mekanshe poischem ben noilid. So what are the Rabbanan Shita? The Rabbanan Shita is, I'll tell you outside, we'll see it inside. It's an interesting thing. The Rabbanan Shita is that, right, Hashem said they're dead. The Rabbanan actually say, but they didn't die. Das and Aviram popping up throughout Tanakh. They're still there. They're making us crazy by Korach. What's the answer? So you all know the famous medrash. They didn't die. They became poor. And someone who becomes poor is ki'ilu, they're dead. So that wasn't an unforeseen circumstances. Not a slave not having money is very common. So therefore the answer is, it's not that when Hashem said that they're dead, they're not actually dead. They're just poor. Fine. Here's the question. So why does that make the neder removed? I guess Moshe Rabbeinu was not afraid of the people. Moshe Rabbeinu was afraid of the people as long as they're considered alive. They were considered dead. So it's a technicality that the neder could be removed, right? Moshe Rabbeinu said, I'm not going to do this as long as they're alive. They're technically dead in halacha because they're poor. But that's not an unforeseen circumstance because they didn't actually die. They just became poor. That's a Pesach, but not a Pesach of an oiled. The only reason why it's interesting is because I never thought of having poor people considered dead would be legitimate in this neder, because the whole neder is I'm afraid of those men that are breathing. I guess they lost their power. That's the point. They lost, when they're poor, they no longer have power of influence, and therefore they're considered dead in halacha. This is not like Rechaim Shmulevitz. Rechaim Shmulevitz had a famous Torah that he says, why is it that those four people are considered dead in halacha? They're going to see, it says someone who doesn't have children, someone who's blind, someone who doesn't have money, and someone who's a chayla. I think it's a chayla. The Gemara talks about it. It's blind, summa, doesn't have children, poor, and a mitzara. So Chaim Shmulevitz had a famous aside that he said all those four people can't help other Jews, they need help. Right? When you're blind, you can't help, you need help. A mitzara is out there, they're takers. So a Jew who's a taker, who's not a giver, is considered dead. But I actually think that Pashut Pshat is what you're saying, is that these people don't have influence. They don't have influence. So because they don't have influence, they're not chashiv. So Hashem was saying they died. Not that they actually died, but they're not influential anymore. They're poor. Don't worry. And because the poverty, according to Rashi, first of all, they might have been poor at the time, but it's not an unforeseen circumstance. Therefore, it's not a case of noilid, not a makar. Okay, we'll just run through it very quickly. The Gemara said the Rabbanan who believe that noilid is not a good Pesach, Hashem used this as a Pesach. My time, kasavri hanikim mi maisi. The Rabbanan say, well, they didn't die. What are you talking about? The pasuk says they died. They didn't actually die. How do I know this? Whenever the Torah uses the word nitzim or nitzavim, which means agitators or instigators, it's always dasan avirim, meaning they're instigating throughout Tanakh. They were alive much later. So how could you say they died? The answer is they didn't die. El Amrei Shlaka Sheyardu Menechseim. They became poor. Amr Rav Yeshua Levi, as Rav Shimon Levi said, Kol Adam She'ein Lo Banim. Anyone who doesn't have children, Chashav Kameis, they're considered dead. Shenemar Havli Banim V'Mayim Eis Anochi, as Rachel Imenu said. I don't know why this Gemara is sort of out of place a little bit. Rachel Imenu said that. Rachel Minu said that if I don't have children to Yaakov, then I'm dead. And Vitanya Arba Chashuv Mason. There are 4 people like they're dead. Ani, poor, that's Dasan of Aviram. Mitzaira, someone who's Saras, someone who's blind, Mishain Lebanim, and someone who doesn't have children. Ani the Chsiv Kimeshu Kol Anashim. This is the Makar. The pasuk says they died. They didn't actually die, but they became poor. They became non-influential. Mitzaira the Chsiv Anati Kames, because the pasuk describes as a Mitzaira that the pasuk says regarding Miriam, that Miriam says, "Don't treat me like a dead person," meaning that Miriam is described as someone who's died because she had saras, and summa blind that my eyes opened up. I was placed in darkness like those that are dead. That blindness is considered death. Some have children. So says Rashi. The answer is it's not a case of noilid. Poverty is not considered something that's unforeseen. That's very foreseen. Therefore, because that's the thing, it's a misconception. When people say noilid, it's a machlokes whether noilid is a Pesach or not. It doesn't just, noilid just means something that developed later. That's not the point. It's not just developed later. A lot of things develop later. It's developed later that you couldn't see. It was unforeseen. Unforeseen developed later. Poverty might have developed later, even though Rashi says they might have been poor at the time. But Pashas, they became poor later. But the answer is that was a poverty that was very foreseen for slaves to be poor. So therefore, it's not a source for noilid, and we still have a machlokes. We still do not have a source. Oh, whatever the Rabbanan feel, there's no source for using noilid as a pesach. All right, we'll stop here.